Australian research is at a crossroads at the moment, and we've been working hard to submit feedback to two major reviews of the Australian research ecosystem, one on the National Competitive Grants Program and one on the strategic research and development situation. And in doing so, I wanted to cover a few common points that I think are really important, at least from my perspective, in informing how we think about reform to these systems. I work across a large number of sectors, or at least interact with them. The nature of my current academic role means I have the very interesting role of spending a lot of time talking to people from a wide range of sectors across Australia, but also internationally. One of the ways I like to think about judging the health of a sector and the viability of the sector is in terms of its new early career talent. And the way I think about it is, if you have a very talented, very passionate, very hard-working young individual who's really set their mind on making it in that particular sector, what are the chances that they will actually make it and get into some sort of sustainable, productive position in that sector? And my assertion on the current state of the Australian research ecosystem is that the chances for a young researcher at this stage are very low, and probably substantially lower than the sort of minimum efficiency point of the system. Another way of thinking about this efficiency point is to think about grants acceptance rates. So in the current system, obviously not every grant proposal that is submitted is excellent. But in many schemes, and obviously this is a spectrum, it's a little arbitrary how you decide this, you can make a pretty coherent argument that the research being proposed in the top 30% of fellowships and grants is all pretty solid research that is likely to generate either research advances in some form or impact for industry, government, or society. And if you have the acceptance rate in reality being 5% or 8%, what you're doing is sort of arbitrarily throwing out a lot of very high quality research without any real signal, because once you get to that very elite area of research, it's basically very difficult to differentiate between them. And so one of the key outcomes I would hope to see from any reform process is to get the research ecosystem into the state where a talented, passionate, and driven person who is really set on making it is by no means guaranteed to make it, but feels like they have a genuine shot at making it in the sector. I think that is a key indicator of the health of a sector, beyond all the other ones that are already being discussed. A second key point I want to make about the academic research ecosystem in Australia is to do with perceptions of the people in it. So I've been in the sector for 20 years, gradually working my way through the system to more and more senior roles. And when I started 2 decades ago, I think it would have been somewhat fair to level the claim that there was a certain small percentage of people who were effectively not effective in that system. Now, I would argue that most of these people were not effective in the academic research system, not because they were intentionally gaming the system. It was simply that they signed up or entered the system many years ago, when universities and what universities do and the research environment was orders of magnitude different to what it is today and relatively recently. So what they signed up for was very different to what they ended up in later in their career, and hence they were not necessarily as effective as many other people were. But nowadays, in 2025, in the Australian research ecosystem, I would argue that there is almost no dead wood. There is no one really cruising and having a lovely old time, just having fun and not having to work really hard. Pretty much everyone is hustling and hustling, working extremely hard, constantly stressed out about their prospects, and generally having a relatively tough time. Of course, there are exceptions, but there isn't really much excess in the system to trim, so to speak. So any reform, again, is not going to milk that much more extra hard work out of people, because people are already working and hustling pretty hard. Another key concept that I think has to be addressed, but is a somewhat sensitive one, is this idea of a balanced workload that you can do in a mandated 37 or 38 or 40 hours per week. So there are extensive quantitative surveys that show that academics on average work much longer hours than this. The joke is always that academics do their research on the weekend. Now, this is both a problem and not a problem. So a lot of academic researchers really love their job, they love their research, and they will quite willingly and happily work those extra hours. But at the same time, there are very good initiatives to come in and formalize and protect workloads in universities so that everything is accounted for. And at some stage, at least in my opinion, those two things are going to be basically fundamentally in tension with each other, because if you want to maintain the current, or hopefully improve the current standards of research quality and output, but theoretically have people working only 35 or 40 hours formally, something is going to have to give. I do not think that is possible. Another key issue is the discussion and debate over exactly what the role and responsibilities of universities are and what the role and responsibilities of research funding bodies in the research ecosystem. And this issue pops up both directly and indirectly in so many different things. Perhaps one of the really high-profile examples of it are our junior research fellowships. So for example, our 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐞 fellowships, which allow an early career researcher to do fairly focused research for 3 years. Now, there was a lot of angst in recent rounds when associate professors occasionally got these 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐞 fellowships. And I think a lot of this comes down to two very different viewpoints on what these fellowships are supposed to do. So in some cases, there are PhDs who make it through to associate professor level within the time frame of being able to apply for these junior fellowships. Perhaps they have had prior experience before they did their PhD, but nonetheless, they are legitimately applying according to the technical guidelines to these fellowships. And whether you think those people should get those fellowships really depends on whether you think the fellowships are to support vulnerable early career researchers to get a leg up, or they are to support highly productive people who are likely to do good research at an early career stage. And depending on what your answer to those questions are, depends on whether you think it's appropriate or inappropriate that associate professors should be able to get 𝐑𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐞 and junior fellowships. Whatever reform we do, universities, other people involved in the system and individuals will implicitly or explicitly optimize for the system. It is a natural consequence. It's something you think about in terms of nudging behavior, and this will undoubtedly happen whatever the result of the new reforms are. I guess we can't avoid it, but one thing we can do with these reforms is create changes that are somewhat gaming proof or optimization proof. We don't want situations, for example, where allegedly universities are having a handshake agreement with someone to hold back promotion in order to keep them eligible for a fellowship for another year so they can apply and then immediately promote them, hopefully, once they got the fellowship. That is probably not a behavior that you're hoping to drive through these reforms. In reading through the various position pieces on this, one of the things, again, in my opinion, that I find a little bit disconcerting is, I think, an implication, or at least this is how I interpret it, that fundamental, really high-risk research will always pay off significantly, just it may take a while. I don't agree with that. There are very high-risk research that should utterly be done, but for the individual involved, there is a reasonable chance that research done over several years will be a bust. It may generate some publications, it will definitely contribute to knowledge, which is very valuable for others, but there'll be a huge difference in the outcome for that individual compared to someone else who did a different high-risk project and made a large breakthrough. Now, in the aggregate, in the system, this isn't a problem. You want a certain percentage of your researchers doing high-risk research because some of them will make incredible breakthroughs that will change humanity forever for the positive. But how you think about, treat, and assess the individual involved is very tricky because you're going to have a huge volatility of outcome for those individuals. Now, often there's a well-intentioned solution, which is, well, those individuals should also be working on lower risk research. They should be publishing lower risk research so that they have that to show for. But really, that is really diluting their efforts, and I don't think it's ultimately solving the problem, because it's reducing their chances of making those really transformative breakthroughs, and it's also generating a relatively middling level of output, which may not really keep them in the game anyway. So how we treat the individual will have to be very different to how we treat the system in the aggregate. The final concept I want to talk about is decoupling research and research activity from research performance. So I would argue that any academic, or just about all academics in a university who teach, should still be doing some hands-on research. They shouldn't just be reading papers or articles, but not actually doing any research, because in that case, they're really no different to anyone else. Maybe they bring a more informed perspective. But I think coupling research to research performance and KPIs for all individuals is really, really toxic. So there's a certain fraction of the academic population who signed up because they were interested in research, they'd like to do a little research, but then gets the joy and interest in doing research killed by this constant unattainable pressure to hit unobtainable benchmarks, at least for them. And so I would be interested in if there is a way system-wide and also at a university level to somewhat decouple research performance and KPIs from the activity of doing research, at least for some people in the university, because they are interested in research. They should do a little bit of research to stay relevant, to be able to teach from an informed perspective, but they are not going to be the people necessarily who bring in these massive centers or grants or lead major initiatives. You of course want to give them the chance to do that, but in reality a lot of them are never going to end up doing that. But that doesn't mean I don't think that they should do no research, because I think that is counterproductive as well. The world is changing pretty quickly. Australia is changing. The nature of research is changing. I've seen a lot of change in my 2 decades in research. And the idea of reviewing and changing research periodically, and how the research ecosystem works and how we fund and support research, I think is a welcome one. I think it can be a little bit confronting, especially the transition for early career researchers who will be affected the most by changes in the short term. But I am optimistic that out of all of this, we can come up with a system that is substantially improved for everyone involved.